Welcome to the College Life Podcast. It's Alicia here, and today I have with me Audrey, Gilfillan, and Alison West. And today I'm interviewing them. They are authors of Decompile Your Mind, an engineer's guide to thoughts and emotions, which I have right here in my hand. And they are also founders of Applied Wellness Initiatives, which helps engineering teams navigate the intersection of performance, optimization, and emotional wellness. They also have several years of experience working as counselors with college students, among other areas as well. So thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thanks for
We're
having
really
us.
excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, it is tradition on our podcast to really get to know what people's experiences have been like in the past when they were in college. So maybe we'll start with you, Audrey. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience. Just one thing that maybe stands out from your college journey.
Yeah. Well, yes, I went to college in the Midwest a while ago, and I kind of just assumed I was going to go to college. I initially went to school thinking I wanted to do elementary ed, and then I realized I prefer to work more with individuals, and I really wanted to get deep and really understand kind of about people in a really deep way. And that's where I realized psychology was something I wanted to do and get into the world of therapy. And Alicia, when you asked this question, a couple days ago, and we were preparing, or I was just thinking about what I wanted to share here today, what came to mind is my sophomore year, I lived with 3 other women, and I had really ambitious friends. Like, they were doing all of the things. They were doing the internships, the research, they had the job, they were getting all of these classes. And I had a different approach at the start of college. I didn't fully know kind of what to expect. I was kind of just there for the experience and kind of thinking, oh, I just do the classes and kind of I'll get through it. And I think there's a benefit. I think there was definitely a benefit to have that kind of more relaxed, fun approach. But there was one day, I think my sophomore year, and just having conversations with my friends who are doing all of these really amazing things in their areas of study. And I had just this moment of panic. I was like, oh my goodness, I am not doing enough. I am not setting myself up to get into the kind of work I want to do, or have the resume to get to the kind of grad school I want to go to. And I just had this realization that I needed to get more involved because I really cared about the kinds of things I was learning, and I wanted to set myself up for those opportunities. But I was kind of approaching college in a pretty passive way. And so what I do when I get panicked is I write things down and I try to get organized. And I took out this piece of paper and I just kind of wrote down different things that I wanted to focus my attention on. I think there's so many things in college that you can put your attention to that it can be really overwhelming and kind of paralyzing. And so I just needed to really kind of sit down and visualize and write down what were a couple areas in my life that I really wanted to put a little bit more attention to. So I don't exactly remember what I wrote, but I think I wrote...
Wouldn't it be cool if you had it though? Oh, that'd be so cool.
I think I wrote I want to learn about research and I want to kind of learn about that world. And I think I knew that I wanted to get more involved in student groups because I wanted to learn, meet more people who had shared interests as I did, but also get kind of explore different areas kind of within my interest. And so I wrote the sheet. It has kind of 4 areas of intention of where I want to put my energy. And then I put specific examples for actions I could take to do that. So I was research. Oh, okay. I could reach out to a TA for the class and just explore opportunities. Or I could look at the bulletin board in the psychology school and just see what's available. And that's something that I think that brought me a lot of comfort, or not comfort, but just clarity when I was feeling that panic and that overwhelm. And that's actually something I do to this day. Every year for over I think I usually do it now, New Year's. I'm what is the intention of what are kind of 4 things that I really want to direct my attention to? And because there's a million things that we can do, and it can feel really overwhelming to get lost in that. So for me, it feels really grounding to be able to do that.
That's really cool. I mean, it's amazing that you figured that out in college, or at least practice that, right? That's pretty incredible. And I would say like very similar. Like I definitely had a passive experience. It was kind of just as things kind of came up, I was like, oh, maybe I will do that instead of really like designing what I wanted, which is really what drives my podcast is because I want students to really be able to use, leverage their experience in college and get their money's worth, and get that experience that they actually deserve. Anyway, so I love that. But it's really cool that you're taking it and you've taken it on into your professional life. I love that.
Yeah, I think like as you know, and it brings me back to like our book, right, which is about emotions and how do you make sense of emotions. And that panic is really uncomfortable, but then how do you really kind of recognize what is your mind trying to do for you with those emotions? And I think at that moment in my life, that panic was telling me, hey, take some action, like change things up because you really care about what you're doing and you want to kind of take more of an active role and how you're doing this college experience.
That's really good. Awesome. Well, we'll definitely dive into the book in a minute. But first, Allison, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your own college journey and yourself.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having us, Alicia. It was interesting hearing about Audrey's experience because there are a lot of overlapping experiences that I've had, and also I handled it a bit differently. So, let's get into it. Um,
And that's
yeah,
totally okay, by the way,
yeah.
if you're listening.
Not everyone has a list like that in college, so very impressive, Audrey. Yeah, so going to college was just the thing to do in my family. I never considered not going. I also recognize that definitely comes from a place of privilege, being able to say that. But yeah, I didn't have any clue what I wanted to do, and so I entered college with an undeclared major. Wasn't too worried about it, just figured something will work itself out once I get there. I tried a bunch of different things. And honestly, it was only through like trying those things that I was able to pick something 2 years in. I picked human development and family studies, which is a very broad area of study, actually, but it did include a lot of psych classes and stuff like that. And it was through that and an internship I had with the homeless population that I realized I wanted to work with people. And I decided I wanted to be a counselor, but I actually decided I wanted to be a school counselor, so more like a guidance counselor. So I went to grad school and I started going down that track. And about halfway through grad school, I realized I don't want to do this. And I wish I had created a list like the one Audrey described. And I think I could have figured it out if I had really taken more time. But at the same time, there was an element of like discovery through experience. And actually being in the schools is what really made me realize that it just wasn't for me. I wanted to get deeper with my students. I wanted to really have the time and space to explore their challenges. And I just had a lot of limitations as a guidance counselor doing that. And so it was too late to change. I finished up my degree with something I wasn't passionate about, but I learned a lot. And I graduated, immediately went back to school for an advanced certificate in clinical mental health counseling, which really was just me doing an internship in like one class. So I didn't have a lot of education left to do with that, but it did take a while. Took about a year. Um, and yeah, I from there I tried all kinds of things. Worked with the homeless population once again. I worked with survivors of domestic violence. I worked with people who struggle with substance use issues and people with bipolar and schizophrenia. And really, it was just like a learning by experience. I learned a lot in all of those roles, and but I always had this feeling that I haven't found it yet. Like I haven't found what I'm really passionate about. There were a lot of things I loved about my work before, but yeah, I knew that I was still searching. And I started working in higher ed as a therapist about 3.5 years ago. This is where it's at for me, I realize. And not just higher ed, but really working with engineers. And you can't, like, looking back, I could have never really discovered that niche by like thinking about it because I didn't even know it was a thing.
Yeah.
Like it really took me to have a lot of different experiences to get to where I am today. So really like it was trial and error. And which involved some frustration along the way. Like, what am I doing? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I was able to learn how to pivot. And I think that's a pretty valuable skill as well.
Yeah, so good. I mean, it's interesting too, like all of us have the same background where we all kind of started like in that education. Like, and I think that that's also just what we're exposed to maybe a lot growing up. And maybe that was potentially our time period too. But like that's how you help people as you go into
Yeah.
education. But we're all in education, but in very a different way than we initially thought. So it's really interesting. But
Mhm.
and yeah, and I love the pivot and gosh, getting halfway through graduate school and realizing that it's not the right thing is really hard. And we don't encourage you to do that. And sometimes it happens, even when you try and you do everything that you think, even whenever people do write their intentions and they're really thoughtful and they do volunteer and they do all of these things, sometimes it just it's that time and it clicks that that says isn't the right fit, and maybe you had flags earlier, or
Mhm.
maybe this was just one big red flag and you were like, this ain't it. And it's just it can happen to us at any time, honestly. And that maybe that I shouldn't say that on the podcast because I don't want to scare people, but it's like also you can bounce back and you're going to be fine, and it's just how you approach it too. And I know it's really hard in those moments though, for sure. So if you are experiencing that, we hear you and we see you, and hang in there because it is a really tough time. So let's go ahead and transition into the book that you wrote, which is called Decompile Your Mind. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, well, so Allison and I, we both work for a university, and there's kind of a unique setup where we are embedded within an engineering school. So we work exclusively with engineering undergrads and graduate students. And the really nice thing is that Allison and I working together, that means that we get to consult and talk about what we're noticing, what we're experiencing, really kind of thinking about how do we best support our clients and meet them where they're at as effectively as we can. And I think through those consultations, we were really realizing how there's some trends popping up with this group of students, right? And there's some ways of approaching therapy that was tending to resonate with this group of students compared to some of our colleagues who were in different schools where the students are studying very different things, and hearing from them of what their students are needing and recognizing the skills required and encouraged in engineering. It shows up differently in a therapeutic context. And so they're needing slightly different ways to approach the therapeutic process for them to resonate, for them to buy in, for them to kind of affect that change.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just add to that. When we started writing the book, we thought, wouldn't that be great if this is something that could be published? But really, we figured, okay, that's pretty hard to like write a book, right? And so we decided to just kind of start out by writing down our ideas of what's been working well for us and what we've been noticing, and sort of having just a place where we can access those ideas easily. It really made us better therapists, honestly. I mean, even if the book never came to be, like it was so helpful to just have it down on paper, like in all in one place. And so, yeah, I'm really glad it turned out as a book, but also it was just valuable as in the process as well.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love that it's making you a better therapist. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's going to help a lot of people too. You also did some interviews, and I think I would love to hear a little bit more about those. And you just did those just to kind of learn more kind of in the professional space of like, this is really applicable to just engineers broadly, not just college students. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about those.
Yeah, we happen to know several engineers, or we know people who know engineers, or people who know people who know people who are engineers. So we are able to, do some just informational interviews where we just ask them like, hey, like, what do you notice in industry? What are some trends? What are some challenges? What are some things you wish you could learn more about in terms of mental health? And I would say there was a decent amount of crossover. And I noticed that a lot of the people I interviewed, at least, really just were excited to talk about it and talk about mental health. It sounds like it's becoming more of a thing that's okay to talk about in those spaces, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think there were a couple trends that I really recall. I think one is a lot of engineers going into industry not feeling prepared in more of the interpersonal skills that are required in the workplace. They felt really prepared in the technical skills through their undergrad degree, but they weren't necessarily prepared to, how do I collaborate with a team? How do I communicate my ideas? How do I advocate for funding? More of those communications. How do I be a good team member and be kind of flexible to the needs of the team? And so that was something that I was hearing quite a bit, that they were feeling underprepared for more of those soft skills or interpersonal skills that are necessary in the workplace. I also think, I think there's a lot of pressure on engineers, right? A lot of engineers, they are designing things that are going into the public and have real life safety implications, right? And so there's a ton of pressure on them when they don't necessarily have all of the time available to them to double check things and, and trial and error as much as they would ideally want. And so just the pressure of that kind of work, when especially there are really high safety demands on their work, it was something that was a theme and a stressor.
Yeah, it's we kind of want you to be perfect, right?
Yeah.
At least in the output that you're, creating, but it doesn't mean that you have to be it in your entire life. Yeah, that's super interesting. And for those of us who are not engineers, tell us a little bit more about what decompile your mind actually means, because, and I know that there are folks who are not engineers, right, listening to the podcast, and there are likely some engineers or college student engineers. So tell us a little bit about decompile your mind.
Well, this is where I ask for some grace because as you know from my background, I'm also not an engineer. And it took a lot of consulting with actual engineers to come up with this metaphor. And so, yes, the title of the book is Decompile Your Mind. It's inspired by software engineering. In general, computers do a great job of communicating with us and handling our day-to-day tasks. This process is very smooth and user-friendly. Beneath that approachable exterior, though, is the internal processing, which is happening, and that's in the machine code language, so the ones and zeros, which is incomprehensible to humans. And it's way too low level for us to make any sense of those ones and zeros. And so we find that this is also often the case for distressing emotions and thoughts, that observing them in that raw and literal form isn't necessarily gonna give us a complete picture of what's going on. You can't really understand the entire psychological profile simply by considering just one emotion or one thought at a time. To really understand the entire thing, you need to be able to have tools to do that. And so when a software engineer wants to know more about how a computer program is running, they use a tool called a decompiler to translate those ones and zeros of the machine code into an intermediate language like Java or C++. Again, I am not by any means familiar on a personal level with those, but I know that those programming languages, they're still pretty technical, right? So just, I can't look at those things and understand what's going on. An engineer can, though. It's still pretty technical, but it's not totally beyond the grasp of understanding if you're, trained in it, right? So with time, they can use the decompiler to understand and interpret what's going on, what the limitations are of the computer, and how to better use it. So it isn't necessarily to fix a bug, but it can be to just understand what's happening. And so the decompilers in our book perform the same function. They won't immediately tell you the secrets of your mental state by any means, but they can kind of help you untangle some of what's going on underneath. You can engage with them in a different way and learn from what's going on. And eventually, the hope is that you can walk away knowing how your brain is behaving and just learn what happens and learn how to respond to it. And so it's almost like the reader creates their own C++ language in going through the book. So I hope I didn't butcher that. That's where my knowledge of those concepts ends, but I really do think it is a beautiful analogy that really captures, like, there's no bug to fix in our brains when we have distressing thoughts and emotions. Really, it's a matter of understanding them more and learning how to work with them instead of against them.
Yeah, the fixing and understand versus understanding is like really resonating. I'm like, ooh, can't we just fix it, you know? If only it were that simple.
Well,
Well,
and I
why
think
don't
our engineers, right? Like they're such good problem solvers. And so they come into our therapy offices wanting to fix it. And so really kind of reframing what the goal of this is. And through these decompilers, kind of how to respond to the emotions in a way that helps them understand themselves better and understands kind of the underlying function of those emotions and distressing thoughts to really help them make decisions that are more aligned with their psychological needs, with their values, with the things that they really care the most about.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the concepts that you write about in the book. So, one of the things that stood out to me was around kind of defining emotional regulation and emotional suppression, because I think that we're not really explicitly taught these things. And I don't know if you both were, but it's just not, it's hard to talk about. I mean, it's why you wrote an entire book about it, but it's also just hard to teach. And now that I'm a parent, I like, you know, I have a 1.5-year-old, and I'm like, how am I supposed to teach him how to manage his emotions? You know, I'm like, how do you do that? And anyway, so it's just really interesting to think about how we do kind of expect, once you become, you know, a full like adult, you're kind of supposed to know how to emotionally regulate. But anyway, so tell us maybe a little bit more about like, what does that mean, emotional regulation and emotional suppression, and maybe how they interrelate, or yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such a good point, right? We don't learn explicitly how to regulate our emotions. And so most of us just are individually kind of getting through our life trying to figure it out. And I think it's hard because it's an internal process. And so we don't necessarily know what someone else is doing to try to regulate their emotions. And so it's just not named, it's not explicit in most cases. So the way I think about emotion regulation is kind of how do you effectively respond to emotions in a way that, one, doesn't cause symptoms, like worse symptoms and other problems in your life, and that, two, is helping you really use that information of the emotions to make decisions that are going to serve your values most effectively, serve you to get your really kind of core human needs met, right? And so suppression is kind of the opposite of that, where we're not effectively responding to emotions and we're kind of just pushing them down. And what happens when we push them down is that they get kind of stored in our body in different like physiological ways. And it really can manifest in a lot of symptoms. There's a lot of research out there about how a lot of health impacts, you know, immunocompromised, right? And gut issues can be really related to emotional suppression. People use different techniques to suppress, right? Some people might use more obvious methods like drugs or alcohol, or like scrolling on their phone or video games just to kind of ignore the things that are hard. Other people might use like work as a distraction, right? And or like exercise. And some of those things are a little harder to recognize as suppression tactics because in some ways they're healthy, but if they're being used to kind of chronically avoid emotions, that is where it kind of turns into a suppression technique.
Yeah. And you all talked about like this beach ball analogy. Can you maybe share that just briefly? Because I loved that. I feel like it really gets at this kind of the emotional regulation and suppression.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a used metaphor that acceptance and commitment therapy, kind of an evidence-based approach to therapy, uses quite a bit. And so it's kind of like, imagine that you're at a pool, right? Like a pool party, and you have this big beach ball that's inflatable. And I mean, I think most of us could probably relate to taking that beach ball and pushing it under the water, right? And to see, can we hold it under the water, you know? And then usually we can, but it's a little wobbly, right? It's like the ball's trying to pop back up. And so as soon as our attention falters or we get distracted, the ball goes straight back up, right? And so kind of comparing that to emotional suppression, right? Like we can suppress our emotions. We can kind of just ignore it and not let the emotion come up. But it does take some effort on our part to kind of push that emotion or push that beach ball down. And so, that might be effective for a period of time. But then, your friends start coming to the pool party. They start bringing music and games and snacks. And if the whole party, you are concerned that you're like, I got to keep this beach ball down, right? You're putting in a lot of attention on this beach ball. And that means that you're not going to have that same attention to really engage with your friends, kind of interact, play a game, maybe have a snack. And so you can keep the ball down, but it really is going to take away from your engagement in the party and in the fun. And so we think about that kind of same process with emotional suppression. Like it works. We can suppress our emotion, but it takes a lot of effort. And in order to do it, it really requires us to sacrifice kind of engagement in life in the way that is really meaningful. And so kind of the alternative of what we're proposing is like, what if you let the ball just kind of hang out on top of the water, right? And you're like, yep, the ball's on top of the water. I'm going to hang out with my friends and I'm going to do the things. And yeah, it's still up there. Yeah, part of me wants to push it down, but I'm going to accept that the ball is floating on top of the water. And then that's going to allow me to still do the things that I want to do. And I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind that the reason that you might not be having fun at the party is not because of the beach ball, right? Like the beach ball's not the problem. It's the effort to try to keep the ball down that's making it hard to like engage in the party. And that's the same with emotions, right? Having some sadness, right? You might not want to show that at a party. But not, I think it's okay to have that sadness, right? The sadness itself isn't inherently wrong. It's just if you're working so hard to hide that sadness or push it down, that it really kind of takes you out of the moment.
Yeah. I do want to add a caveat to that. Like Audrey said, there's so much research on emotional suppression. It's linked to so many different things, including cardiovascular health and anxiety and depression and all of that. But I think what the studies really show is that it's typically the chronic suppression that can lead to those things. There are times where it's totally appropriate and effective to suppress emotions. And I think our book is pretty clear about having that flexible approach, that there are times where, you're not going to be able to emotionally go there and engage with those emotions in that way. And you need to get through a project or a presentation or just a long day at work, and you're not in an environment that is psychologically safe for you to engage with your emotions, and that's okay. But then that requires some intentionality on your part to like figure out, okay, like where is my outlet? And so yeah, I just wanted to, there's a lot of nuance to just about everything in life, and this is no different.
Yeah, I was just listening to something recently and they were talking about because of social media and the way we kind of engage in content now, it's like if you only capture this like one piece, it seems like people can like hate on that one clip, right? That is, it takes, you're listening to the 15-second clip, but you're not getting the full picture because you didn't hear the whole conversation and really have a understanding or read the book or what, like you're only seeing this one kind of glimpse. And you can only go so far, even in a podcast, right? Even if we had 3 hours to talk about this, you still can't unpack everything so clearly for every person. I love the caveats, and we know that we're not going to catch all of them either. So there are a ton of caveats with this type of work, and it's complicated because our emotions are not easy to even just define, much less understand in ourselves, and then engaging in that with other people too. It's so interesting and really hard. So
Yeah. One thing that I would like to add, so emotional suppression is a way to avoid emotions, but it's not the only way. And actually, what we see a lot with our engineering clients is intellectualizing of emotions, which is another way to avoid them. But it's a little more camouflage. It's hard to really pick up on what's going on when that happens. But basically, it just means that someone becomes very logical about an emotional situation. They kind of turn to reasoning and analysis to avoid what they're experiencing. And so that is also very nuanced and, again, hard to detect at times. But sometimes, the thinking can kind of protect the person from the feeling.
Yeah. That's a favorite of a lot of engineers, right? Because that thinking serves them really well in other spaces in the engineering world. And it can kind of be deceiving because it can kind of be like, well, I'm talking about it, so I must be processing my emotion. But because they're processing it in more of that intellectual way, they're not kind of emotionally riding the wave of the emotion.
Interesting. Well, I want to talk about this table that you all created about you have kind of emotions listed, and then you talk about like what that might be, what the need is behind that emotion and kind of why we feel that, or one reason, right? There's multiple reasons, but kind of like what the need is driving that emotion. And I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the details of that, because I think that that's like because we can kind of talk in circles about this very broadly, and I just want to make sure that listeners are getting some practical takeaways. Even though we can't fix it today, we're not going to fix our emotions. It's really just about trying to kind of understand ourselves a little bit better when it comes to emotions and how that impacts our mental health. But yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about that chart and really just, yeah, the emotions and what the needs are behind those emotions.
Sure. Yeah, so one of my favorite questions to ask clients is, what is that emotion trying to do for you, right? Because emotions don't just show up for no reason, even though sometimes it can feel like that. There's some kind of underlying function or intended function of the emotion. And so really trying to be curious about what the emotion is trying to do for you, I think just puts a different perspective on understanding that distress. And so we have this chart in the book that kind of lists a handful of emotions and then some possible needs that when those emotions come up, it might suggest that there's a need there. Again, there's nuance here, and we talk about that in the book. And so we're not going to cover everything, but it is kind of a way for you to kind of start thinking about, what could this sadness be trying to do for me other than just make me feel really upset? Right.
Yeah, so what does sadness do for us? What does that tell? What is it trying to tell us?
Yeah, so this is something I nerd out about. I get so excited about this, especially with sadness. I did not know this before writing the book.
I love sadness.
Sadness, right, is like, when do we feel sad, right? We feel sad when we had maybe a goal for ourselves or a certain expectation, and that expectation or goal didn't pan out. Right. And so we feel sad because that opportunity didn't happen the way we wanted it to. And so sadness, one of the functions of sadness is to help your mind reorient to the new set of circumstances and to say, okay, yesterday when you thought this was going to happen, that's no longer the case. So we need to reorient our brain to kind of refresh its settings to say, okay, nope, that's no longer the reality. And it kind of clears the mind, which is a painful process. It doesn't feel good, but that is necessary for that to happen in order for you to be open to new possibilities and set a new goal that's based on the reality of the new circumstances. And so it's really painful, but it's kind of your way for your brain and your mind to kind of say, okay, let me reorient to the reality of these new circumstances so that I can create a new goal that is appropriate for what's happening right now.
Yeah, the word reorient really is like sticking out to me. And it's not something a word that I hear very often. So it's really an interesting kind of take on this. And I love that. And I think one of the things that you also mentioned is like you kind of need the connection or support from others. And I love that too. It's like acknowledging what I thought was going to happen or what I wanted to happen didn't. And yeah, I like that reframe. It's just really awesome. I love that. Tell us maybe a little bit about happiness. So the opposite. So if we're experiencing kind of happiness, what is the need there?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So happiness, right? That's like, it feels good, right? When we're happy. And I think based on kind of the research we did for this book, happiness is our mind's way to say, hey, you're onto something. Something about what you're doing is important and is aligned with your needs and what's valuable to you. And so keep doing it, right? It's kind of that dopamine or that excitement to say, hey, you're onto something that is meaningful to you. And so here's some good emotion, some happy emotion to kind of reward you, to tell you, hey, keep doing this because you're on the path to something that is feels important or is a good situation for you.
Yeah, and I think that's so relevant for college students because we don't pay attention to that sometimes. Where, okay, who are the people that I'm around that make me happy? What classes actually do I enjoy? Like, I don't mind going to this class because I'm interested in the topic, or I'm actually reading the textbook because it's kind of interesting. Like, Allison, I was in human development as well, and I remember actually really loving to read about human development. I thought it was super interesting. And other books, like I took a physics class and I was like, oh my gosh, like it was kind of interesting, but not in the same way. And astronomy, I hated, thought I would love that. You know, it's just a different approach, but we don't pay attention to that emotion, I don't think, a lot either. So then we can't seek it out, I guess. And again, I think just with a college student right now who's listening, like pay attention to that because it's so important for you to seek those things out, those experiences. And as you're thinking about like your career and what's next, if you can find something that makes you happy, it just makes your life so much better. But anyway, I know we're not talking about career stuff right now, but let's maybe talk about anxiety and what do we need when we're experiencing anxiety?
Mm-hmm. So anxiety can be really messy, right? I think this is probably one of the most common symptoms or experiences that students come into our offices because they're like, this anxiety feels awful and I don't know what to do with it. It's really uncomfortable. And so one thing that I think can be valuable is just differentiating it from fear, right? So fear is the reaction, the emotional response or emotional experience to something that's immediately dangerous, right? So I don't know, I think it was a year ago, I was walking the dog and a car was sliding on ice and kind of coming in my direction, right? That was a fear response, right? That was my body saying, hey, get out of the way so you don't get hit by the car. I was not hit by the car. Everything was good. But I did experience that fear response because in that moment, there was a visceral present danger. Anxiety is that kind of similar, but more about potential danger that could come up in the future. You're not physically in danger in that moment, but your mind's kind of anticipating, oh, this could happen, or this could be bad, right? And so one thing that I find to be really helpful for myself and for students I work with is to kind of frame the anxiety shows up around things that we care about, right? If we didn't care about something, we wouldn't feel anxious, right? So maybe students who are experiencing some test anxiety, if they, didn't care about the test or the class or their academics, they would have no reason to be anxious. And so kind of recognizing, okay, there's something about this experience that I care about, which is a good thing, right? Like it's good and powerful to care about things. And so really trying to remind yourself, okay, there's something about this that I care about. And yes, the anxiety is painful, but it is really valuable that I care about this. And I want to be curious about what about this experience is important to me.
Another thing I just want to add, anxiety is designed to be super uncomfortable. So we like to use a lot of psychoeducation with our clients about that, that there's nothing wrong with your body when you're feeling that discomfort. And in fact, your brain is literally trying to keep you alive by giving you that nudge that you need to prepare for what's to come. Sometimes that understanding can be really helpful when kind of changing that relationship with anxiety, thinking about, yes, like I care about this. This is why this is coming up for me. Also, the purpose of this anxiety is to make sure I'm paying attention. Mm-hmm. It's not to disrupt what I'm doing. Sometimes it can get to that point where it's more disruptive and, that's, go further into a treatment for that. But in general, anxiety is something we all experience at different times. Yeah, once you can kind of learn how it works, it can work for you instead of against you.
We might need to have a separate podcast about how to do that because, and I do think like the college students that I've worked with before, not in the same context as in a therapy context, but when I've worked with other students, and even just in my class that I teach, the sadness, happiness, and anxiety, it's so powerful in your college journey. I mean, it's powerful throughout your entire life, but like in college, it's just this like set of uh, circumstances and experiences that just amplify a lot of things. And so I think talking about this and thinking about how does this show up for me, and what do I need to learn more about myself in order to be able to like manage and support my mental health in a positive way, is so important. So I know that y'all are obviously very pro therapy, and so am I. And I just, want to encourage anybody who's has anything coming up for them during this time to really like take a look at that and just go and talk to a counselor on your campus. Most college campuses have resources like that or can connect you with somebody in the community, and so we just really encourage you to take advantage of that because it's just so helpful to explore yourself and to build that self-awareness. Well, I do know we're running out of time, and one of the pieces that I really wanted to dive into was around applying these skills and how do we actually implement this in our lives and make sense of it. So not necessarily fixing that problem, but almost just kind of make sense of it. And so you go into applying these skills specifically around perfectionism, connection, uncertainty, and imposter phenomenon. I have ones that I want to cover, but I want to know if there's maybe one of you, each of you pick one to really like dive into that you love and you want to talk about because you think it might be relevant for listeners.
Sure. Do you want to go first, Alison?
Sure. I guess what comes to mind for me is perfectionism. This is something that we see a lot with engineers. And like you said earlier, Alicia, sometimes really they do need to be perfect, or the product needs to be perfect. And it requires that high level of, paying attention to detail, and it needs to be, safe for people to use and whatever it is. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there, but what we've noticed with engineers is that a lot of times that perfectionism is, sort of built into someone's DNA, it feels like. We all receive messages growing up around like the work we do and how we can gain love and connection from others. And sometimes people run into a situation where their achievements and the quality of their work is conflated with that love and connection. And so that can be really powerful, and it can be really hard to shake that off. It can be really hard to change that relationship with perfectionism. And so we see it not only in, where they need that perfectionism in their work, but also in other areas of their life, even outside of academics. Like everything needs to be perfect all the time. And that's absolutely when burnout can happen. And that doesn't help anybody. At that point, the burnout can really be very disruptive. So one thing that we go through in the book is exploring values and learning how to notice distressing thoughts related to perfectionism and learning to understand them instead of just responding to them. So being anchored in those values while also like not fighting those thoughts that come up that you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, but also being curious about what's coming up in those moments and not necessarily acting on those thoughts, and learning to tolerate the distress of doing something imperfectly. Actually practicing doing things imperfectly, that you can afford to do imperfectly, and building that muscle. And so really when we talk about emotion regulation and also the thought decompiler, which we weren't able to talk too much about today, but is also in the book, our goal is to help people gain autonomy over their decisions and not be run by these automatic thinking patterns that they've had since childhood, or these, these emotions that come up in really charged situations, to really be able to create space between what is happening their thought and then what they want to do about it. And so I don't know if what I said was as tangible as you would like, Alicia. I'm happy to provide more detail, but it is sort of it's a big topic and there's a whole chapter about it. So I encourage people to read it.
Yeah, and I think too, so just like with perfectionism, I mean, I think it resonates with a lot of people outside of kind of the engineer space, but you're right, it's like this unique context there. And I think in a lot of spaces that have worked with young people, you don't have to be perfect in a lot of spaces, but we feel like we do. And I think that's like where I love that you're kind of trying to help people think through like, where can you be imperfect, right? Like try something with the intention of like, I know this isn't going to go well. And that is really uncomfortable. And most people hate that and they don't want to be in those spaces. But that, like, especially during your college experience, no matter what age you are, if you're a traditional age college student or not, like, there's a lot of space for you to explore and to fail and to experiment. And using that as a way to do that will help you, I think, with that perfectionism and managing those emotions alongside and paying attention, right, to what does come up. And I think y'all use a lot of examples throughout the book to really highlight what this looks like, what it can feel like. And yeah, I loved one of the ones that you did share around perfectionism. But yeah, so I think there is still like the practical piece there for sure. And it's like you got to practice it in order to really kind of know what comes up. And then you're able to see it in other spaces too.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain doesn't learn by thinking things through and trying to like think yourself out of a certain pattern. It's really like the experience that matters the most. Our brains pay attention to our actions. And so if we're able to practice doing that more and more, it becomes easier to regulate in those times.
Awesome. Well, Audrey, which one do you want to dive into?
You know, I want to talk about uncertainty. Right?
I want to talk about it too. Let's do it. Uncertainty. Oh, why do you care about uncertainty?
Oh man, because
Kidding.
it's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, I think, you know, uncertainty is a chapter that I kind of primarily wrote. And I think I was drawn to it because it's something that I personally struggle with, right? I want answers and I want to know I want to know what to expect. And it's hard for me to sit in what's going to happen and am I going to be prepared and is it going to work out, right? And I think this is something that shows up in the counseling space especially with engineers. I think everyone, but I think with engineers it shows up a lot, right? They might not necessarily think about their concerns from the lens of uncertainty, but as soon as we kind of like scratch, or like move a layer of what's going on, it's really clear that that difficulty tolerating uncertainty is a big part of what's contributing to their distress. And I think with engineers, right, a lot of their job is to get rid of all uncertainty, right? It's to say, okay, how does this machine or this device going to work? And how do you prevent it from not working? And how do you anticipate all of the potential pitfalls so that doesn't happen, right? And so that mentality works really well in an engineering context when there are specific tangible things you can do to control the outcome. But when it comes to life and our mental health, it's hard to prepare for all of the outcomes, And I think when we are not kind of consciously tolerating the uncertainty, we fall into kind of autopilot coping mechanisms, right? Kind of what Alison was saying, right? And so that might be, okay, maybe if I work hard enough, I'll kind of get this sense of no anxiety ever, right? Like if I achieve enough, then I'll never have to be anxious again, right? And that's kind of an illusion, right? Like that's not true, right? We know really successful people who still experience anxiety, right? And so, that's just one example of a way someone that might try to cope with uncertainty when that intentionality or that kind of awareness isn't there. And so we really, we kind of connect those really hard emotions and distressing thoughts that can come up in uncertainty and say, okay, how do you take one of those emotions? How do you take one of those thoughts, put it through our decompiler to better understand what does that emotion and what does that thought tell you about what you really care about? and what you need, and then how can you problem solve and put your energy towards something that moves you closer to those needs and towards those values, rather than trying to kind of indirectly fix uncertainty in a way that's not really effective, not really sustainable.
Oh, uncertainty. Yeah, and I think kind of goes along with like what we talked about with perfectionism of like going to something that you're not sure what to expect, right? Like it seems like that's like an underlying thing that folks can try and figure out like what's coming up and really pay attention to the feelings and the emotions that you experience in those spaces instead of just being like, oh, this sucks. Like, actually kind of sitting with it, which and not doing anything because that's what I want to do. I want to also fix them in a different way, but yeah, like it all comes back to trying new things and but paying attention and reflecting and learning, which is why having a therapist can be so helpful in these situations to like do it and then reflect and process with a therapist with these complex emotions and thoughts. So as we wrap up, is there anything else that you feel like really you needed to share about the book or about the work that you do that would be helpful for college students?
Well, I know this book is like directed toward engineers, and we have some metaphors that if you're not an engineer might be a little harder to understand. But I think in general, the content of this book, I think applies to all college students, especially if you're a college student that kind of is more of like a logical thinker. I think listening to some of Alicia's previous episodes, right? I think you have very much a focus around like purpose. And really what my hope is with this book is if people can learn how to relate and understand their emotions more effectively, it's going to give them more insight to what their purpose is, right? And so using that emotion regulation, using the decompiler to say, okay, what are these emotions telling me about what I really care about? And how do I translate that to purpose of what I really want to invest my time in, what I care about, how I want to impact the world in a way that's really important to me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's almost just like this like self-awareness foundation is so critical. Yeah.
I guess one thing I'll add is that we poured everything into this book. We were intentional with it, and it took us a while to write it and to do all the research. Everything that we, claim and all the things that we say work, they're backed up by science and a bunch of research and evidence-based practices. So I don't know. This is something that is just like near and dear to our hearts, and I'm really excited that it's now something that we can share with others. And so if any of this sounded interesting today, I hope the listeners can go check it out.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Audrey, you are muted right now.
Thank you. Yeah, so our book is for sale on Amazon. So if you go to just Amazon, you can search Decompile Your Mind and it will pop up with our names next to the book. And then you can also see our website at appliedwellnessinitiatives.com. And then with that website, there is a little contact information. So you can send us a message through our website if you want individual support or consultation, or to kind of see how we can bring our services to your engineering team.
Yeah, and we're also on LinkedIn, and Applied Wellness Initiatives is on LinkedIn as well. We don't have an Instagram at this point. Maybe that will change someday, but I don't know, not likely. So yeah, you can find us on LinkedIn or our website.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alicia.